All right, I think it's about time to get started. Yeah, this is your first year speaking here, right?
Yes.
That's awesome. We love new people joining us, and we love new topics. I don't think we've ever had a talk on blockchain, and I think it's something that confuses a lot of people and gets misconstrued. So even I'm really anxious to hear about this. Please welcome our next speaker, Morvareed Salehpour. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm going to be talking about blockchains and the legal implications there today. How many of you are familiar with blockchain technology in general? Oh, okay. Do you all kind of have a basic understanding, or should I just give a quick, okay. So let's just talk about kind of what blockchain is in general, or what the kind of idea behind it is. So basically the idea for blockchain is it's a decentralized ledger system. So they're trying, basically you're having transactions that are occurring and you're storing data instead of storing it on a centralized server, you're storing it on a whole bunch of nodes or servers across the world where different parties have control over it in a true blockchain, so that you have this kind of transparency and more kind of veracity to the transactions. Additionally, because you have so many different places where the data is stored, if someone hacks, for example, one single location, they're not able to change the ledger entry because the other locations will basically say, oh, well, that's the wrong one. We're going to ignore that transaction and continue with the actual, the correct ledger entry. Something that when there is a centralized system, you're able to hack and change the transaction there. All right. And some of the key features of blockchains are that it's transparent, it's public, and it's immutable. So those are meaning you can't really change the entries. So now we're going to talk about what happens when there's transactions occurring on a blockchain, and what is the kind of legal effect there. So when you have a transaction that's occurring on a blockchain, there are multiple ways where it can still go wrong. Basically, blockchain, I know a lot of people talk about it as a kind of solve-all problem for all sorts of use cases and industries, but they fail to realize it actually makes things more complicated, and it's a situation where things are still going to go wrong. It's not going to solve everything. So one of the ways where a blockchain transaction can go wrong is just from smart contract error. So this is something that you would think of as the DAO hack, which 50 million was basically was stolen during that and caused the Ethereum fork in 2016. The hacker there took advantage of the error in the smart contract code to be able to take out the Ether. Additional way where transactions on the blockchain can go wrong are just more traditional methods. For example, fraud. So one example I like in the blockchain space is the supply chain blockchains. I think it's one of the strongest use cases in the space because it makes sense in terms of being able to track where goods are coming from and taking out intermediaries in those transactions and paying out for all the different stages in the supply chain. However, that doesn't stop the fraud potential. For example, a lot of these situations, there is a tracker on the products that are being transported to the supply chain. Someone could always take that tracker off of the product that's being transported and put it on a different product or a deficient product, and that product then arrives and the information uploads to the blockchain saying, this product has arrived, so now we're automatically going to pay out per the smart contract. So the good has arrived, the payout has occurred, and the person who's received the good doesn't learn until later when they go to look at the goods that it's not actually what they ordered, or it's deficient in some manner. So that's a situation where fraud has occurred. Someone has basically changed out the goods, but the blockchain transaction, the smart contract, was not able to stop that or realize that, and it already effectuated it. So now you have a dispute. So the result of either situation, whether error or some kind of intentional act like a fraud, is you have a business dispute that's occurred on this decentralized system, which is now more complicated because there's issues that are unique to a decentralized system that you don't have in a centralized system. So what are the challenges in these type of transactions when you're dealing with a decentralized system and a dispute has arisen? So there's a couple key issues. One is jurisdictional issues. Where is the court going to, when are you going to be able to call someone into court? What law is going to apply? Those kind of issues. Two is liability issues. Who are you going to hold liable in a decentralized system when transactions can be occurring anonymously, or someone could be committing the bad act and you're not able to locate them because it's a decentralized system? Third is enforcement issues. Even when you get an order from a court or you're trying to engage in some kind of governance, if you can't actually either locate the parties or have jurisdictional control over them, how are you going to effectuate any kind of order that you may have? So now we're going to talk about kind of jurisdiction in detail. So blockchain transactions, because they occur on these various nodes that are located in different jurisdictions across the world, basically means that any transaction could be subject to the laws of every country where a node is physically located, because the transaction is occurring simultaneously in all those locations. The issue with this is it's creating a situation where there is conflicting laws and regulations that can apply to any transaction, and it leads to a situation where if you end up in court, the court is going to have to address that conflict of a law analysis, basically having to engage to determine, do they have jurisdiction over this party? Who is the appropriate parties who may have jurisdiction, and what country's laws apply? This is the thing that basically makes litigation a lot more complicated and costly, because in centralized transactions, those issues are in most cases set out and determined by where the parties are, by contract, all those kind of issues. So it's an easier issue to resolve. Because there's more uncertainty with a transaction that's occurred on the blockchain, it creates a situation where these litigation costs have arisen, and that hurts parties with fewer resources. I'll answer questions at the end. And that in turn basically may put certain businesses that are startups or smaller businesses out of business. One of the cases we can kind of look at, so one of the jurisdictional issues that's come up recently is a lot of these people who are moving into the blockchain cryptocurrency space try to avoid or claim they can avoid like US jurisdiction, for example, by setting up a business abroad. So that's something which doesn't really make sense. If you're taking advantage of commerce in the US, you'd be subject to its jurisdictional laws. It's not really a valid loophole to say, well, I created my company in a foreign state, so I am not subject to US law. And case law is already developing now, confirming that idea. So for example, in the In-Ray Tezos Securities litigation, which is a multi-district litigation against Tezos, so they had a multi-district litigation basically means they had a whole bunch of class actions filed against them, and the courts consolidate these into this big multi-district litigations that's based out of the Central District of California right now. The court basically had a recent holding not a couple months ago. Tezos filed a motion to dismiss saying that these claims are not appropriate, there's no jurisdiction over us and all the different parties involved with the Tezos. One of the entities was a Swiss registered and based entity. The court basically said that they couldn't avoid US law and jurisdiction just by structuring the legal entity abroad. And the court said, you need to actually look at the circumstances of the transaction and what's going on there. You can't just look at where a company's registered and where they even had a statement in a contract saying we're going to have Swiss jurisdiction apply. So our court said, that's not sufficient. You need to actually look at the transaction. In that situation, they had the people in the U.S. were investing in Tezos. Most of the nodes were actually located in the U.S., so in U.S. jurisdiction. The founder was based in the US. The website that hosted the server for the website was based in Arizona. The court looked at all these factors saying, you're not going to be able to avoid US securities laws. There's also an additional case that just came out about a month ago. So this is the SEC, actually two related matters. The SEC charged someone who was basically operating as a crypto broker, but also kind of exchange, doing buy and sell swaps. They didn't comply with US securities law. It was based, the company was registered in the Marshall Islands, and the founder was an Austrian citizen and was based in Austria. The SEC charged him with a complaint, as well as the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, saying basically you have sought investment from US consumers, you're taking advantage of commerce in the US, and you have failed to comply with securities laws, you haven't registered as an exchange, you haven't registered the buy-sell swaps you're doing, everything was done. He was doing it all in Bitcoin. And the government said, you're not going to be able to avoid US laws by basically registering abroad or transacting in cryptocurrency. Just because you're transacting in cryptocurrency doesn't mean the laws don't apply to you. So the second area where issues arise is liability, as we discussed. So this is the question of who is responsible for losses that is caused, for example, by smart contract error. So the situation would be a lot clearer if you are in this supply chain blockchain and you figure out where the fraud occurred, right? You can locate which party committed the fraud. That's an easier situation. But what about this situation where the error is, the issue that the dispute has risen has occurred from an error in the code? So who's responsible for that? So this becomes a question of determining who can you even locate and go after in this decentralized system. So some of the issues that are developing are, for example, developer liability. The people who made the code, who created the blockchain, may be liable for basically the smart contract error. Additionally, it could be the centralized parties who are running the blockchain. So one thing to consider is a lot of people talk about the blockchains now, and they say they're decentralized and public and all these good things, and they make it sound, so, kind of world-changing. But if you actually think about it, almost all the blockchain currently in existence are not decentralized. They're all centralized. So for example, EOS has the block producers. They're the centralized parties who control EOS and are able to change the rules of governance. So if something went wrong, they could be all sued and brought into court. Even with any kind of smaller blockchain or even the bigger ones, the node operators are centralized parties. So it's something where it's not truly decentralized, it's just a different kind of form of centralization, like we are used to corporate companies, for example, Fortune 500 companies, where we know who is in charge, who the central party is. But with a lot of these blockchains, there are centralized parties, but we have less transparency actually about them because we may not know who they are. We don't have corporate filings as we do for Fortune 500 companies. So we actually have less info on a lot of these centralized parties. So that's another thing to consider with blockchains is how can we locate these parties, and are we okay not having as much information with these people who have control over these governance issues? Additional way to think about it is, 51% attacks occur in a lot of these blockchains, and I don't know if you're familiar with what a 51% attack is, but a lot of the smaller ones are subject to it. It basically means anyone who can control 51% or more of the nodes that operate the blockchain is able to take control and effectuate their rules of governance. So they're basically able to change the path of the blockchain going forward to be in their interests. And that's happened over the summer. There was 3 of them that occurred within a couple days, the biggest one being a Bitcoin Gold, where 17 million was basically stolen because someone took control of 51% of the nodes and basically cashed out and then went back and undid that transaction, kind of awarding themselves the Bitcoin gold again. So they basically recreated the double spend problem, but in a new manner now using a 51% attack. And that's a kind of interesting issue that the smaller blockchains will have to address and basically decide how do we try to protect against this, which it's difficult to do when you have such a small blockchain with few miners or node operators. It becomes a situation where it's difficult to kind of, trust in the immutability there and the transparency. And the additional complication with that is that whoever can basically commit the 51% attack, they don't even need to spend that much money or time to do it. All they need is a lot of miners, I know miners who rent their mining operations. So basically a hacker would only need to get control for like an hour and basically commit the 51% attack. Even 2 weeks ago, there was a college student who was live streaming one of these 51% attacks. He got cut off from the live stream on YouTube, as he was going forward. So he didn't effectuate it, but he actually was using it to show people how it's so cheap to basically be able to commit a 51% attack on a blockchain, a smaller blockchain. So with these liability issues, given that when people basically lose out on a smart contract error or some kind of transaction where they're going to be at a loss, they're going to want to be able to hold parties responsible. So that's a situation where these truly decentralized blockchains where no one's in control. For example, there's one that's, I forget what it's called, but it's forking every week to try to avoid any kind of centralization of control. That's a situation where it's just not going to likely succeed because governments want to be able to execute and control over the blockchains, and users will actually prefer that because they want to be able to enforce governance once disputes arise. Another kind of issue to think about that is, I know people who have, for example, I know a woman whose husband died and they had $2 million in cryptocurrency assets. She's not able to access that because she doesn't have the key. So that's a situation where if we're wanting to use blockchain and cryptocurrency on a wide-scale basis, there has to be somewhere where someone can go find the key if they lose it, because most people are not going to follow the advice of writing it down on a piece of paper and putting it in a fireproof safe. That's not going to I think that's not going to happen on a wide-scale basis. So another issue that kind of arises with these transactions that go wrong on a blockchain are enforcement issues, as we were talking about. So there is a case that was filed this year, again, called Brola versus Nano Railblocks, and a plaintiff, it's a class action. A plaintiff is a nano investor who invested $50,000 in Nano, and he has alleged securities violations and fraudulent representations by Nano and its founders arising from $170 million in Nano that was stolen from an Italian digital currency exchange called BitGrail in February 2018. So among the relief that the plaintiff has sought in that case, he has sought a court-ordered rescue fork to compensate the victims of the theft. So are you guys familiar with what a fork is in the cryptocurrency world, or do you need so basically, a fork is when the people who are part of the blockchain cryptocurrency have to decide to proceed forward on one protocol over another. So when Ethereum had the DAO hack, they forked and basically decided to reinstitute the money that was stolen. So this is what this plaintiff in this case wants. He wants to basically have the Nano blockchain forked so he can have his funds that were stolen in the BitGrail theft back. So this is an interesting thing about how can you effectuate that. Say the court even orders this fork. Okay, but they don't have jurisdiction over the Italian cryptocurrency exchange, so how are they going to effectuate that? Secondly, they don't have jurisdiction over the people who are actually all the people who are part of the blockchain. So how are they going to prevent anyone from deciding to proceed on the unforked protocol, so the original protocol? So that's an interesting issue. Recently, for example, there's been a case against, are you familiar with Centrotech? So Centrotech was a company that was basically saying that they were going to create the first credit card for cryptocurrency. You would be able to use the credit card in brick and mortar stores, and then you would be able to pay with basically cryptocurrency. They were using a lot of celebrities for their promotion of their product, and they did an ICO where they raised $30 million. There was nothing really backing any of their statements or their alleged product. There wasn't any product yet. It was just statements made. So they actually tried to run off with they were trying to run off with the money, and the SEC indicted all three of the founders, including one that was getting on a plane with a bag of money. And in addition to the SEC indictment, there is a civil action. So there's a class action that has been filed as well. So recently in the class action, the plaintiffs moved for a temporary restraining order, asking to freeze the ICO wallet, and the court granted that. So that's a really kind of interesting issue for enforcement. I think the incentive there is for, obviously, Centrotech to comply, given that they are facing the criminal action as well. So that may be a situation where enforcement may be a little bit less contentious because they are having to face the criminal action. But that's a situation where we have an ICO wallet that's been frozen. So that's pretty interesting. All right, before we go into some of the other examples of these issues and complexities that come into play, I want to talk about some of the more recent cases that are coming down in this case and the kind of case law and the interesting developments that are developing there. So just yesterday, the SEC announced an action against Ether Delta. So they were a cryptocurrency exchange, and their founder was charged with operating an unregistered securities exchange. So he had basically been running this token trading platform for 18 months and there was $3.6 million in trades over it during that time. So the SEC charged him, saying that you failed to register as a securities exchange and you didn't try to comply with any potential exemption there may have been. So you're now subject to this criminal action. He settled with the SEC, so he got a lower penalty, didn't end up in jail. He had to basically disgorge all his profits of $300,000, pay a interest penalty of $13,000 and a $75,000 penalty. So this is interesting because there's so many trading platforms that are not complying with the law, and this shows that the SEC is trying to come after them too. It's not just the ICOs that the SEC is going after. They're going after other parties who are not complying with the law in the space as well. Additionally, kind of interesting cases are so in the ICO space, there is a lot of these businesses who are basically not failing to comply with securities laws. For example, one of the cases that was interesting recently was, and it's actually going forward to trial, but the defendant had tried to dismiss the claims before trial. It's called U.S. versus Zolovisky, and it's out of New York. And they basically, the guy who was running that was claiming that basically diamonds, the tokens that represented diamonds and real estate ventures were not securities. And the court said, no, those are obviously investment contracts. You're subject to securities law. You can't get around it by saying you're tokenizing, these assets. Additional issues that are kind of are raising in this area is, for example, um, a lot of the issue, I don't know if any of you are familiar with, for example, phone porting. So that's an issue that a lot of people in the cryptocurrency space are having issues with. That's where someone steals your phone, or basically call your mobile carrier and basically pretend to be you, and the mobile carrier gives you the phone number to them. And that has been used in a lot of cryptocurrency hacks. The most probably biggest one that made a lot of news was there was one, again, someone ported Michael Turpin's phone number, and he had 24 million in cryptocurrency stolen for him. So he filed a lawsuit against AT&T for this, and he is seeking to recover the 24 million that was stolen plus 200 million in punitive damages. So that is going to be an interesting case to see how it develops, and I think it's also going to, I think it's important because it's going to create developments on the porting issue, which a lot of these mobile carriers are not addressing. And then with a lot of these blockchain and cryptocurrency businesses, you still have like other traditional disputes. So there is a dispute right now. Are you guys familiar with Augur? And so it's a blockchain that basically does, kind of like markets where you're able to anticipate what's going to happen, what's not going to happen, these kind of betting markets. They actually have a lawsuit for 152 million because they're in a founder dispute. So someone who was, a founder has left and been cut out, and so they're suing each other for 152 million. Additionally, with Augur, I think one interesting issue that goes back, I think I'll get to it maybe later, it's the issue of, like, it ties into this developer liability where on their blockchain, they now have an assassination market. So people are betting on who's going to be assassinated at what time and when and all these kind of stuff. And you think about that, something's bound to go wrong at some point, and you think about who's liable in that situation. I mean, arguably it's negligent to create a situation where you have an assassination betting market. So I think at some point they'll likely be subject to a lawsuit relating to that. All right. So what are some other examples where we see the issues about jurisdiction, liability, and enforcement, and other complexities kind of come into play relating to blockchain? So some of the areas where we'll see this are, divorce and crypto assets, copyright and blockchain, node operator liability, and privacy in blockchain. Okay, so I'm going to talk about California, kind of what community property, or what divorce and property rights are in California, just because we're in California and makes the most sense. So in California, we have community property and separate property designations. So separate property is everything you have before marriage that you may inherit, either before or after marriage, or anything that kind of comes basically, for example, is purchased with property that was separate property. Community property is anything you earned during marriage, anything that you and your spouse get together. The complication is that, so anything monetary, like for example, any money, that's very fungible. So if you are putting community and separate property into the same bank account, you can't then, it's difficult to claim, oh, well, I meant to purchase, for example, this vehicle with my separate property. It's really hard to trace that. So the assumption is that when you put it into one account, it all becomes commingled and it's all kind of assumed to be community property. So wallets where cryptocurrency are stored are the equivalent of bank accounts. So if you're having all your pre and post-marriage assets in one wallet, commingling has occurred. So it's the assumption, it's community property. So this, again, leads to enforcement issues because while the court may issue freeze orders to bank accounts, well, there's not as much precedence for that in terms of wallets. There isn't a kind of accepted method. Who do you send the freeze order to? Is it to the company that runs the wallet? Is it to the individual who has the assets in there? These are kind of issues that are developing. As we know, it's definitely moving forward, as the ICO wallet I was talking about was frozen in the Central Tech case. But I think it's going to be a situation where if you get into contentious divorce situations and there are a lot of cryptocurrency at issue or other crypto assets, unless the party with the access and with the knowledge is willing to kind of come to the table, it's going to get costly in terms of litigation, having to subpoena and try to get control over that wallet. So copyright and blockchain is another interesting area where issues arise. So a lot of people in the blockchain space talk about how blockchain is going to resolve all these IP, intellectual property issues, how it's going to make it, more fair, how it's going to be better for royalties, and all these kind of amazing ideas. What they fail to kind of consider is that it actually makes things more complicated in the sense that piracy is a lot easier. You basically, on any blockchain, an anonymous party can embed an encrypted material. When they do this, it's easy to embed material that belongs to a copyright holder and then distribute it without the knowledge of the copyright holder. Then, because it's been anonymously embedded into the ledger entry, it's difficult to identify the culpable parties to send these Digital Millennium Copyright Act takedown requests to. Additionally, it's difficult to effectuate any kind of compliance with a takedown request because you're dealing with this immutable ledger entry. You can't really change it. And thirdly, the same issue arises in terms of infringement action. Who are you going to pursue it against if you don't know the actual liable party? Is it going to be the node operators, the centralized entities that are ruling the governance in the blockchain? So let's talk a little bit more about node operator liability, which is a really kind of interesting area. So as we talked about, you can basically encrypt and embed materials in the ledger entries on a blockchain. So this can take the form of illegal materials that can be anything from the pirated copyright material we were talking about to child pornography, state secrets, blackmail, and malware. So node operators are supposed to keep a copy of this embedded illegal material on the node, and they are then subject to potential liability for those crimes, even if they are unaware, so they don't have knowledge. So for example, certain crimes are strict liability, meaning you're liable for it whether or not you have knowledge, whether or not you know it's been engaged in. So in China, for example, dissemination of state secrets is strict liability. So if someone is a node operator in China and a state secret has become embedded in this ledger entry and they've distributed it, even though they don't know, they're liable. So this creates a kind of conflict because these node operators don't want to necessarily take on this liability, so it becomes a threat to blockchain integrity and immutability. Additionally, a recent development in this area is that China's censor, government body, just last week issued some new regulations saying that anyone in China who runs a blockchain business or is a node operator is liable for what is on the blockchain. So they are basically responsible for anything that's put on a blockchain, and they need to basically be engaging in censoring actions, which is something that's probably resolved the fact that last year a lot of people in China were using this encrypted embedded material to basically engage in free speech and encrypt materials that the Chinese government didn't want spread. But that creates a scary situation for these people who are operating blockchain businesses and nodes in China, because they're now specifically being told they're liable for crimes that that may be through this encryption that they may not even be aware of. All right, so then another kind of interesting issue with blockchains is privacy issues in blockchains. So as an initial matter, private data is more appropriate for private blockchains or permission blockchains because you have rules you have to comply with, for example, HIPAA rules. So you don't want medical data on a public blockchain. You want it somewhere where only the entities that the consumer may want access, give access to, have access to it. Additionally, a complication is the EU's GDPR, which is a big issue for blockchains. So for example, GDPR has a right to be forgotten. That means someone can reach out to the business that's running it and say, well, I don't want this fact, for example, what's come up so far has been, people who had past loans and may have, past bankruptcies, and they're contacting, for example, Google saying, well, I don't want that coming up, so I have a right to be forgotten, delete that. Okay, well, a blockchain's immutable, so how do you engage in that? How does a blockchain business comply with that? So this is like some of the complicated issues where many blockchain businesses are just foregoing transactions in the EU because they can't comply with it, or they're having to put a situation where they're working with some kind of data controller to try to address some of these issues. The additional complication is that this summer, California passed a similar law that will be going into effect in 2020. So this is an issue that these businesses will, even the ones based in the US and in California, will have to face because it's coming up in a couple years. Additionally, the fact that only California has passed the law doesn't mean that they can get out of complying with the law if they're based in a different state, because if they're dealing with California consumers, they're liable for the law, are subject to the law. And you can't really control a situation where, say, a California consumer goes into Nevada. How are you going to even be able to track that? So you're going to have to end up with a standardized law for the whole country. All right, I'll take some questions now. Thank you.
Anybody have questions? Yeah, there's one.
So with the blockchain, if you're creating a smart contract, and you addressed this slightly after I saw this, was could the contract explicitly create jurisdiction? Is that something that contracts can, normal contracts can do that. Mm-hmm. Can these smart contracts do that?
So that's something, it's not so the smart contract is basically, it's not a real contract. It's a self-executing code. So that's why you need the lawyers and the developers kind of working together, because you're going to have to enter into a traditional contract, and you're basically converting provisions from that contract into the smart contract, the provisions that can actually be converted into code. You can put some forethought into jurisdictional issues and how to address that on the forefront, and that's something that I think companies should do, because it'll help in their arguments in terms of when you do get to court. But there are complications about what is the appropriate method to do that, right? So there's different ways you can get consumers to agree to a contract provision, and the courts have basically developed case law about what version of that is appropriate, like when does someone have knowledge and can actually agree to something versus where you're just including it as boilerplate. That's not something that will comply.
Anybody else? Questions? I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So I have some friends who are lawyers,
Mm-hmm.
and if I mentioned blockchain to them, they would just give me a blank stare, right? Like they would have no idea what I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So you're clearly seeing an increase in the need for knowledge around blockchain and digital technologies. Where's the tipping point where this is just commonplace and everyone's going to need to know about it? In the legal community, at least.
Yeah, I think, I obviously got involved in this space very early on, kind of, learned about blockchain in 2013, 2014, and it's just, I'm interested in tech and blockchain. I feel like most lawyers are still not understanding the space, as you say. I think some people are curious about it, but I think you're not going to really see, I think what we need to get to is a situation where as I said, these blockchain businesses are, and the developers and the lawyers are in the same room together. And I think that's not going to happen until we continue to see more enterprise applications and more widespread use case of blockchain. I think 2019 is going to be a year where we see more enterprise applications and see it become more widespread. For example, going back to the supply chain blockchains, Walmart did a test with IBM this past year where they were tracking, sliced mangoes down. And they were able to track it, they did the traditional method where, they call or they followed whatever system they had, and it took 6 days, 2 hours, and it was 6 days, 18 hours, and 2 minutes. They did it on their beta of the blockchain supply chain, and it took 2 seconds. So that's a big difference. And it creates a situation where even though some people may claim that's not a true blockchain because it's controlled by Walmart, a centralized party, okay, it's a private blockchain, but it's still beneficial because they're able to track these transactions down much quicker. They are able to do, for example, targeted recalls. Instead of having to recall all their lettuce, they're able to be like, okay, we're going to just recall the lettuce that went to this store on this date and potentially even was sold to specific consumers if they include that data. There's additionally the potential for there to be, so they will have more transparency in their transactions too. And I think the idea for a lot of people who are interested in blockchain is that at some point, this idea of multi-chain, so these private blockchains will be connected to a public blockchain, and certain data will be available to the public. So we may get knowledge of where our goods are coming from. For example, like what farm is our lettuce coming from? And this is something that now, at least on the private scale, not that second level of attaching to a public blockchain, Walmart is rolling out for their greens in the coming year. They're, having their suppliers have to get on board. So we're going to be able to see a wide use case of the supply chain blockchain in Walmart this coming year. So that's a really kind of exciting place to be, and I think will continue to motivate more widespread application as we see those kind of successful use cases.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? All right, one more round of applause for Morvareed.